This is Hands Like Hide, a podcast for men who know the weight of a long day, the ache of sore hands, and the pull for something more. Through raw stories, biblical truth, and practical wisdom, we explore recovery, growth, and how to become the man you were intended to be. Because every job teaches, and every story has the power to transform you and everyone you lead. Let's get to work. Let me paint this picture for you. We live in the woods in south central Pennsylvania in an older house. And in south central Pennsylvania, we have a lot of black snakes. And generally, like most snakes do, they try to find a warm place to hang out in the wintertime. And they find their way into the basement of our house. And it's generally not a problem because they just kind of like hide up in the rafters of the basement and in the holes in the block wall and then things like that. And every now and then, I'm going to say once in a blue moon, we get a snake in the house. I would say probably once every 3 to 5 years or something like that, but not that often. But to get into our basement, we have Bilko doors from the outside. And if you don't quite know what Bilko doors are, they're like a trapdoor style that you open up the trapdoors and then there's stairs that you walk down to get into your basement. Most all Bilko doors that I've seen also has a latch on the inside so that you can latch your doors for security and safety so no one else can get in. Well, several years ago, my son and I were behind the house. We're doing some work. We're tinkering. We're messing around. And I needed to get into the basement to get something. And he might have been maybe 6 or 7 years old at the time, something like that. And he already knew about the snakes. He already knew that, we have snakes in the basement through the winter time and this, that, and the other. I said, well, Bo, why don't you go ahead and open up that Bilko door and let's just go down there and see what we can do. I don't know if I want to, Daddy, because what if there's a snake there? And I said to him, I don't think there's a snake there. There shouldn't be. I think we'll be all right. But, if we bend over and just open the door, we'll be okay. So he reaches down and grabs this Bilko door. And it's like the worst possible scenario you could imagine to happen in this situation. He reaches down and he opens the Bilko door. He just grabs it and just opens it. No, the snake wasn't on the steps. The snake wasn't on the threshold of the door. The snake had its tail looped around the latch on the underside of the Bilko door so that when my son grabbed it and opened it, the snake whipped like a piece of rope when swung out like that. And my son, he freaked, as rightfully everybody should freak. But he freaked so bad that he couldn't breathe. He's standing there and he's just like making these groaning sounds. Like, I couldn't even do it justice for me to try to like mimic it or copy it. But he was just like his whole body locked up and he couldn't even breathe. He was just, anyway, it's really funny now when I think back on it, but it was not funny at the time. Okay. It was a little funny at the time. I got to work through that and grow through that on my own. But where does that lead us? That leads us to a whole bunch of fear that we got to work through. Thanks for joining me today. This is the Hands Like Hide podcast, and I'm your host, Charlie Pfeiffer. Today, we're going to be talking about fear. And I tell that story to kind of illustrate this process of how things can happen to us that generate a whole bunch of fear, and it's a trigger, and now we've got to work through that on our journey of recovery and growth. To get us started off, Proverbs 22:13, Solomon writes, "The sluggard says, 'There's a lion outside. I shall be killed in the streets.'" Fear has a voice. And sometimes it sounds really reasonable. And so I want to talk about this idea of fear. A lot of times in recovery and in my own journey, if I was afraid of something, I wouldn't do it. Or I would go to numb that fear, that feeling of fear. When in reality, the fear is there to help me. So think about your brain. Your brain is wired and is designed to keep you safe, keep you secure, keep you alive. And so as you're going through life and as you're growing up, these things will happen to you. You're going to be introduced to situations like a snake flying out of a bilko door at you that's going to create a whole bunch of fear that in the future when you meet similar circumstances and similar situations, the fear is going to say, "Now wait a minute, there's danger here." Because I remember that in the past something happened and it was not good. It was not a good situation. In this passage in Proverbs, this guy is paralyzed by fear. Obviously, like in our day and age, it's very uncommon for you to look out your front door and literally see a lion standing there. Chances are it's not going to happen. I mean, I've been outside with a lion before, but that was on a safari in Africa once, and it was like we jumped out of the car and there was the lions laying under the tree, just laying there, and my mom kind of freaked out, and we just jumped back in the car, and like nobody got eaten on that day, which is always a good thing. But what we're talking about here is this idea. The sluggard says there's a lion outside. I might not I might not survive if I go into it. So, what's a sluggard do? He's not doing anything. He chooses to not act. He chooses to not make a step to grow, to change, to do the hard thing. He just says, I'm not going to do anything because I'm afraid of it. He's being controlled by his emotions in these situations. Growth and healing requires loss. And we're afraid of loss. When you think about your job, if you love your job, then you don't want to lose it. Think about your spouse or your children, or if you're a musician, your favorite instrument. You don't want to lose those things. Loss hurts. Loss is a loss is an emotion that a lot of times we don't want to deal with because it's uncomfortable. It's strong. I know for me in my addiction, loss would lead me to acting out. Loss would lead me to porn, to alcohol, to cigarettes. Loss would lead me to medicating with sugar or caffeine, any of these things to numb those emotions because I don't want to feel loss. I've had a lot of loss in my life, a lot of loss in my life, which I know you can relate with that. So when you think about growth, because it requires loss, something in us must die. Something in us, we have to willingly let go of something so that we can move into something else. Paul writes in Philippians 2:12, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. So think about that. Work out your own salvation. Salvation means healing, growing, restoration, recovery. We can say all of that works with that. We're not earning healing, but it's required. Transformation and healing shakes us to our core. It means laying down the old, letting go of something that we've held on to for a really long time. So in the story with my son, over the years, he has overcome that incredibly terrifying event when a snake came flying out of a bilko door at him, literally at him, and he can now open our bilko doors and go down into the basement. He's cautious, as he should be, right? But he has worked past that fear. He had to let go of this idea that behind every bilko door, there's a snake waiting to fly out and get me. And that's what happens in trauma. That's what happens in our lives. When that bad thing happened to you a long time ago, which I'm sorry it happened, when it happened, your brain coded that, and your brain said, every situation moving forward from now on, here's what the result of that. There's a snake behind the door. And it takes support. It takes the support. It takes that group, that mentor, that friend, that community that we talked about in last episode to help you through what's called an emotional corrective experience, which is in essence The next time, say 6 months to a year later, I wanted my son to work through this fear that he had. And so I went around the house and I opened up the Bilko door and I checked. There's no snakes. It's the middle of the summertime. Everything's fine. And then I closed the Bilko doors. And then I went and got him. I said, hey, let's go down to the basement. And I stood there with him and we worked through this process of him being okay with opening the Bilko doors. Now, I knew for a fact that there wasn't a snake there because I checked. It was safe. And it took us this process of over and over repeated events of emotional corrective experiences with someone who's there to help him, who's been there, who understands it's okay. And he was able to overcome that fear through that process. Now, I want to throw this out to you. Jesus never promised safety, right? We can think of verses, we can think of times where he's like, in this world you'll have trials and tribulations and all these things. But what he did promise is transformation, and transformation requires courage. And it takes courage to look at your fear right in the face and be curious. What is this fear trying to tell me? What is this fear that I'm feeling? How is it trying to help me? And so, what I want to give you is for this upcoming week, try this in your journals. When you feel afraid, I want you to get your pen and paper and I want you to write it down. Name what it is. I fear talking to this person at work. And then I want you to explore that a little bit more. Why? What is it? What is stirred up for you in those moments? Maybe because I fear rejection. Maybe because I fear authority figures. Maybe because I fear that I'm going to get laughed at, that my feelings in the situation aren't valid and they're going to be minimized. I want you to kind of write that all out. And then what I want you to do is approach it with compassion and curiosity. I want you to approach it and say, I understand where that came from because maybe you grew up in a situation, maybe you had a teacher, maybe you had a boss, it's your first job who was a dictator tyrant, right? And it was his way or the highway or her way or the highway all day, every day. And you didn't have a voice at all. You just had to go to work and shut up and do your job, right? So maybe in this situation, um, that's the snake behind the door. But nevertheless, you need to open that door. And so, curiosity, compassion. I understand where this fear is coming from. I understand how it's trying to help me. And then I want you to do something like this. This may sound absurd, but just try it and see how it fits this week with your process. Thank the fear. Thank you for trying to keep me safe. Thank you for helping me grow, helping me from not being hurt. Thank you for helping me not experience a snake flying out of the door again. Okay. And then write this in paper. I think this is really important. Or tell it to yourself, right, with a little bit of self-compassion. But I've got this. We're okay. I've got this. Now, this isn't some, hypothetical type stuff, right? What I'm sharing with you is a concept that I've used in my own recovery many, many, many times. And what you're doing is you're reparenting yourself. You are addressing the wounded child within you, the wounded part of you that's afraid to open that door again. And you're saying, as the adult, I checked. This is okay. We're going to be okay. And let's do this together. So, in other words, you're kind of giving yourself an emotionally corrective experience. Um, what's really amazing about the brain is I read this blog yesterday by psychiatrist Tim Jennings on his website, Come and Reason Ministries. And he talked about the blog was about the gut brain connection. It's pretty interesting information in there. But he talked about the brain can't tell the difference between a real physical threat, like a bear coming to attack you, and an emotional or psychological threat. In other words, something welling up from within you. To the brain, it's all the same. To the brain reacts all the same. It fires all your adrenaline systems. It ramps up your Oh man, I had total blank on that. Immune systems, thank you, right? It gets all of that stuff ready to ward off the threat or potential danger, be it physical, the snake's flying out of the door at you, or be it emotional from the inside. I think a snake is going to fly out of the door at me, right? Does that make sense? So, so in those moments, it takes that self-compassion to say, I'm afraid of this. Okay, it's okay to be afraid of this. Why am I afraid of this? I understand why I'm afraid of this. I got this though. We can do this. And then just journal out the steps you want to take, how you want to make this happen. Pick up a phone, make a call, call your buddy, call your guy, call your group, call your mentor. If you need somebody to talk to, hit me up. I'll talk you through it as well. Um, I hope that this has been helpful for you. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.